Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, we need to talk about that fucking election that just happened, although at this stage, of course, it happened a wee while ago, so I can't say it just happened. But anyway, we need to talk about that election that happened this year, part two of part two. Now, some people, of course, would probably say that I should call this part three, but I reserve to myself the right to call my parts whatever I want to. Anyway, so in the previous two parts, I've talked a little bit about the general um, silliness and unreality of um, both the actual proceedings and the commentary about them. So one of the problems I've had with the many post-mortems that I've consumed since the election um, is that they tend to all be treating the subject matter as if we don't live in a decadent and deeply corrupt civilization, as if somehow the mechanics of what's going on need to be analysed as if they fit a pattern um, of a democratic theory of elections, whereby you campaign on a platform of policies and people like your policies or your personality or have some sort of trust in you and vote for you on that basis. And of course, we live in an era of extreme manipulations. We live in an era of uh, many focus groups and um, a great deal of complexity in the way they uh, use deceptive ways to induce people to vote one way or the other. Now, they used to have what was called the WWF theory of politics, which they applied to US presidential politics. And that the idea of the WWF theory is that the two sides in the duopoly yell and scream at each other and pretend to be enemies. And in fact, they're not enemies. They have already decided in advance who's going to be president, and it's all just a show by basically a singular body pretending to be two parties. And of course, this certainly, I mean, there is definitely, uh, even if it's not literally true, there is a level on which it is obviously true that that is what's going on. As I mentioned, the evidence is quite strong that the Democrats weren't really trying to win this election. Um, it turned out they had polling from early on when Biden was still supposedly their candidate, showing that he would lose in a landslide. Um, and instead of allowing that a democratic process uh, to put forward an appealing candidate, they chose instead to do the least movement away from Biden that you could possibly do by choosing Harris, who had not broken 1% with her primary campaign and who has had terrible approval ratings. So they chose someone who was unpopular and then ran a campaign which was the most expensive campaign in the history of, I think, elections anywhere, anytime, which they still lost, in part because they refused to do anything that would actually induce people to vote for them. They and some of the some of the alienating features of the campaign seem so on the nose that it's really difficult to reconcile that with the idea that they really wanted to win, really wanted to prevent the takeover of fascism that they were warning about, and that they were really concerned about Donald Trump. One of the things that shocked me was when I found out that Harris used the line "I'm speaking" more than once, and it wasn't something she'd said off the cuff. This was clearly what um, she'd been coached to say when she was interrupted by protesters, and it is a line absolutely finely calculated to make people angry, certainly to alienate people who might want to vote for her. The Democrats have obviously a bit of um, a tendency to um, take on the school mom hectoring tone as their way of opposing uh, Republicans who I mean, I think a lot of people know aren't going to be good, but the way the Democrats go at it is to lecture people, and it doesn't seem. It seems more like they are a support system allowing the Republicans to run terrible candidates and be viable, and vice versa. So, the two parties seem to support each other and running appalling candidates, as I've mentioned in previous episodes of this. Now, so there's this WWF theory. Of course, the WWF is no longer. It was changed to WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, because they were sued by the World Wildlife Fund over the use of those of the acronym. So, um, and um, I want to propose a sort of using a WWE model as a way of understanding politics. And yes, it's not really a serious model, but I think that the similarities between the way um, modern professional wrestling works, which is more complex than in the old WWF days. Um, it, it, it reflects on the way politics works, and increasingly there is actually an interpenetration of the two. We have the participation of people from the world of professional wrestling entering into politics, particularly through the Republican Party. So we have people like Hulk Hogan, ripping off his shirt at the RNC. And yeah, I know people use entertainment all the time, but the CEO of WWE, the wife of Vince McMahon, is has been nominated by Trump to head to become Secretary of Education. She had previously been Secretary of Small Business, or maybe Business, I can't remember which. Under Trump, under the previous Trump administration, so there is a little bit of an interpenetration, not least because Trump himself has appeared in the WWE. He and Vince McMahon had a match in which they had proxies fighting each other, I think, and then it devolved into them fighting each other, and then McMahon lost and Trump shaved his hair. All very entertaining, of course. According to everyone concerned, Trump was a natural at this. In fact, I don't think that's entirely coincidental. I think that Trump has consciously taken elements of professional wrestling into his politics. But the reason that that happens, I think, is that there is a confluence there already between the way in which professional wrestling is conducted and the way in which deceptive political rhetoric is conducted, which is also confluent with psychological operations conducted by covert agencies and public relations, in as much as these things seek to control narratives. So they're always trying to put their own spin on things, not necessarily by never admitting wrongdoing. Again, we're referencing the sort of limited hangout thing I was talking about earlier. Sometimes it's by getting ahead of wrongdoing and pre-admitting it, maybe even before you do anything wrong, by priming people to have low expectations of you, which is one of the appeals, as I will talk about, of taking on a persona that is a heel persona, uh, which both Vince McMahon and Donald Trump have done. So there's and the other place where there is a bit of a confluence of these sorts of techniques is, of course, reality television, where basically, I mean, these are all areas in which reality isn't really real. So, but not 100% unreal either. So, it is it is a world of simulation. It is a world where they deliberately try to walk the line between what is real and what is unreal, which provides deniability. And of course, as I have mentioned before and talked about for a long time, that doesn't necessarily mean plausible deniability. It can mean implausible deniability, where you claim that you deny something in an unbelievable way, but no one can say that you are lying about it. You just pretend to be idiotic or mad to such a degree that you believe the unbelievable, and it's quite so there's nothing to argue with there, because what you're stating is not very credible in the first place. So it's quite a useful technique, because you're not providing any critics with anything to grab onto there. So to understand the WWE and why it might teach us something about the way politics works these days, I would like to reference a recent documentary, which is called Mr. McMahon. It's a 6-part Netflix documentary, each part being over an hour long, around an hour, just over an hour long. So it's a substantial piece of something, because I'm going to use the term documentary to describe it, but in reality, it's not fully a documentary, because it does actually function to inscribe some of the unreal narratives from the WWE, and presents them as reality. So it is, to some extent, itself a simulation of a documentary. It is, to some extent, kind of reality television masquerading as documentary. Um, and it's always a difficult line to know. Everything is crafted, of course. All documentaries are. So there is a difficult line there. However, there are key moments where they act to maintain key false narratives that help keep the mythology of the WWE alive. So that's why I call it a sort of simulated documentary. That and something else, actually, and I might as well start talking about it with this. So at the beginning of the documentary, they reveal that um, they had almost finished uh, filming the documentary when a massive scandal broke. And the scandal was that Vince McMahon had been accused credibly of very serious sexual um, uh, wrongdoing, sexual assault, including degradation of a woman and trafficking her to other men. And as is often the case, once something like this, the big story breaks, then all of the other stuff starts coming out. And it turns out that he had paid out multiple in settlements in the millions with NDAs to silence other accusers in the past. Now, what the documentary does is that it brings it starts with this and then just kind of shelves it and then gets into what originally presumably was the planned narrative telling the story of the WWE, which certainly has its scandals, ups and downs, but it's like this elephant in the room is kind of pushed aside and then brought back again, and then pushed aside again, so that it's constantly brought in and out, and thus kind of gets buried in a bit of in amongst some other stuff. Not all of which is celebrating, uncritically the WWE by any means, but it kind of does celebrate the energy of it. There is definitely a celebratory aspect to it. And the I mentioned previously that instead of dog whistling, people have taken to using more than one tone at once. I compared it to throat singing. And this documentary is like that. I read two reviews of it, and one said it was like an expose of the ultimate rottenness and, like bravely exposing everything that's wrong with the whole thing. And another said this is a great celebration, especially a nostalgia trip for people who loved wrestling and want to relive some of those moments. And it's like, you watched the same thing, did you? It is a little bit difficult to understand. Well, it's actually pretty easy to understand. People tend to view what they think they see, and um, it, it, this sort of technique has been around for a while. I've just been reading Norman Solomon's book, War Made Invisible, which I highly recommend. And he mentions that Daniel Hallen, who studied the news media during the Second Indochina War period, what's known as the Vietnam War, and found that they were very much supportive of the war, almost completely uncritically, until the public turned against it, much against the mythology that would suggest that the news media led the way. Well, they didn't, and they usually don't. Once the public turned against the war, their reports actually started to read. Uh, they kind of walked a tightrope. They would read in two ways, so that a dove would read an anti-war statement in them, and a hawk would read a loyal pro-war statement in them. And of course, the eventual synthesis was to emphasize more the suffering of the US soldiers, something that both sides could agree on. And, we end up with anti-war things that are actually very racist and chauvinistic, in terms of like Hollywood products like The Deer Hunter or First Blood, the first Rambo film as well. Um, uh, Obviously, subsequent Rambo films wouldn't have qualified as anti-war in any way. But the idea, it's like the joke from Frankie Boyle. Not only um, does the United States send people over there to slaughter your um, men, women, and children, but then 20 years later, they make movies about how sad it made their soldiers feel. You know, not sure if I've done justice to Boyle's lines there, but you get the sense of it anyway. They find ways, and it's not. It's like the Germans settling on the idea that the Germans were victims of Nazism, which isn't a lie entirely, but it's not the way you would normally talk about a history of a people that created a movement and that movement doing all these awful things. But it's a kind of synthesis that suits the necessities of the national myth. And, the US and the Germans are not the only people that do this by any means. Um, so, anyway, so we've got this media writing that media copywriting, at least, because it's often broadcast, um, that conveys these two messages at the same time. This documentary sort of works on the same level, and you can also see how this is also a bit of a part um, of wrestling tradition, where they're at one stage playing to an audience that knows, they're nodding and winking, to the ones who know it's scripted, while pretending otherwise to those who don't, just as sometimes children's entertainment works on two different levels as well, one for the adults, one for the children. Now, Donald Trump, of course, is a master at this. Um, he will, for his supporters, he's talking on two different levels. One is kind of tongue in cheek, whereas I think some of them don't recognise the tongue in cheekness, and that is also built into the fascistic nature of what he's doing. And it is sending, he's using what a deniable form of semi-ironic, even self-effacing humour to, uh, on the one hand, excite uh, violent right-wing tendencies amongst some of his followers, but also sort of allay the fears of that amongst others by seeming to mock those ideas in himself. And of course, it works. There is a third way it's perceived, and that is that a lot of the um, hysterical anti-Trump people will take him at face value and make themselves look a bit less credible by uh, treating it as if, well, uh, coming across as humorless shitlibs who don't get the joke. You know? And in a lot of ways, I don't blame people for not wanting to see the joke. There is a history there of what has happened when people like Adolf Hitler were often written off as not to be taken seriously. And I do understand that, but I think you have to be very careful in the way you treat that, because otherwise you're simply walking into a trap. And there is a level to which the people who suffered from Trump derangement syndrome have actually smoothed the way for Trump's return to power. So, yeah, so Trump uses this. double meaning thing, um, which is kind of part of this. I mean, I think it is a key symptom of the simulation. One of the things about the wrestling, what World Wrestling Entertainment has done, where it's gone further than the old days, call them the WWF days, although, there's a bit of a crossover there, is to constantly push the boundaries of how far they can take things where they're confusing fiction and reality, how much they can push people into not knowing which is real and which is not real. The answer is, the answer is very simple, that it's almost all not real. I mean, it's almost all completely fake. And I think that's a lesson for politics as well. But what they do is they use emotion to get people to switch off their critical faculties. So it might be shock that certain things happen that are unexpected, and the increasing hype, the hype and more hype and more hype and more hype. So WrestleMania 1, was this big thing, and then WrestleMania 2 had to be bigger, WrestleMania 3, the stakes get higher and higher and higher. Very much like US presidential elections, I think the tagline for 2024 was, "This time it's consequential." Every time the stakes seem to get higher, the budgets certainly get higher. Not that that helped the Democrats win, of course, but this is all part of kind of getting people to buy into something that's actually nonsensical over and over again. And people have for some time been circulating the Charlie Brown and Lucy cartoon with, "This time you kick the ball, I'll let you kick the ball," and that, this is the Democrats have been running on that sort of platform for a very long time, and every time it's they're just finding new ways to suck people in. So this is very much how the WWE works as well, and the way they move be outside of the ring in order to make that sort of sense of reality. So I guess that with wrestling, there's probably always been like shit talking, or for a long time there's been shit talking, but they really made much more elaborate storylines that went outside of the ring, backstage, and all around, and then um, use that to uh, confuse people as to which part is real and which part is fake. When of course it's all fake. So they one of the things that they do, obviously, one of the elements of the world, well, the professional wrestling world, which goes back before WWF and all of that, is that it's a sort of improvised theatrical performance, but the performers have traditionally stayed in character all the time. They have a word for it, kayfabe, which is used to remind people to go into character, which comes out of, I think, circus or something like that. But the tradition in professional wrestling is that if you're giving signing autographs, if you're giving interviews or anything like that, you stay in character. You do not break character. Now, for me, this was exactly what Straussian neocons do with their politics. I don't think that they believe a lot of what they say. Neocons, of course, these days people think of neocons as just almost shorthand to mean war hawk. But of course, um, they are people who have taken on an ideal of moral, simplistic narratives. They believe in promoting the idea of the US is a force for good in the world. Leo Strauss, who is the intellectual godfather of considerable number of neocons, loved the moral simplicity of westerns. I think he liked he wrote about, the TV program Gunsmoke, uh, where where they put the white hats on the good guys and the black hats on the bad guys, so you know. So they believe in that, and I think this is something that uh, inspired Irving Kristol as well. This sort of moral simplicity that is meant to be something that you feed to the masses, and the neocons particularly took it on board and acted it out as part of a role they played. And I believe they still do. And not quite the, again, like neocon now just kind of means hawk. So I'm not, it's not necessarily as quite the same as it was, but that's the basic version of it. And one of the things um, in the wrestling thing that that Vince McMahon has kind of invented, that although again he's drawing on tradition from the wrestling industry. When you create a character, it is a version of yourself, obviously. You're not. It's not picking a role out of Shakespeare. So you actually create a fake version of yourself. We see. I mean, we see people like Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon doing this sort of thing as well for comedy's sake, and you kind of they play with the idea that you don't know where the real person ends and the fake person begins as well, and you kind of sometimes I think maybe their audiences are a little bit credulous too, because I think they sometimes think um, that a lot of it is real, when I think the amount that's actually real is absolutely minuscule. It's tiny, but this is what they do. They play with that, and McMahon invented a character called Mr. McMahon, and that's what the Netflix series is called. It's called Mr. McMahon, and it's about Mr. McMahon. Now, Mr. McMahon is an evil billionaire heel who is a greedy philanderer. Now, it is pretty interesting considering the news that broke about him. Um, I think one of the inspirations behind this was that before he became a character, when he was just the owner and a commentator on wrestling, there was a movement to unionize because the wrestlers were working 365 days a year. They had no contracts. If they were injured, they had the choice of either wrestling while injured or not getting paid. And it was very rough on them. It was very hard. And Jesse Ventura, who later went into politics, tried to unionize. And he went into politics maybe in a different way, more of a person entering politics due to a genuine ideological bent, I I presume. But later, when the Mr. McMahon character came about, he was the enemy of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and so this was part of their story. Their story was Stone Cold Steve Austin was accusing him of all sorts of bad things. So in a way, there was a bit of mimicry of the reality of wrestlers getting pissed off with the real Vince McMahon. It got played out like acted out like it was a trauma or something. The and and so this became a way of well, it's a way of creating entertainment, obviously, but it also seems to be a way of controlling a narrative. Um, so his character is this heel, right? So I've talked about heels previously, and why um, in politics people play the heel is a way of misdirecting away from the misdeeds that make them vulnerable to other misdeeds, character flaws, and that sort of thing that don't that people will criticize them for, which actually don't carry the same significance. Now, when you're creating a heel character, you're basically uh, pre buying the leeway for misbehavior in some ways. So, if you think about early on in Donald Trump's presidential aspirations, he went out of his way to say that if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, then no one would do anything about it. Now, that is not a vote winning statement. No one's going to say, oh, well, great, I like that guy. What it is a way of of uh, priming people to react less to future behaviors. And actually, this is what Donald Trump has done in a disturbingly successful fashion. He's kept pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable, and then people just accept it, especially because it is done in rhetoric and often posing as humor or theatricality, hyperbole. So this again is, I think, um, part of what comes out of wrestling into politics is this style, um, which again, you might not think that applies to the Democrats in the same way, but it really is changing everything. Everything is moving towards that, and the you know both sides are trying to create the sense of crisis. This is again nothing new. There is a documentary about a team of election managers who travel to Bolivia from North America, from Canada and the USA, to engineer an election win for a guy called Goni, who became Bolivian president, a very unsuccessful president, but they managed to get him into the office in the first place. And the documentary, tellingly, is called Our Brand is Crisis. And the thing about crisis is the sense of crisis, again, it works like the hype, the melodrama, the hyperbole, the sort of gish galloping, as well, the sort of rapid series of events that you can't keep up with. These things all work to keep you emotional and keep you from thinking. So the obviously, so Mr. McMahon creates a persona. Donald Trump also has a persona, the Donald, we call him. Again, not 100% different from the real person, I'm sure, but not actually the real person. But there's a reality in which no high-level politician is real anymore. They are given training and told what to say by technicians often. People who they're not theoreticians, they're not ideologues, they're people who are purely instrumental in their instructions for what to do. And this is why politics is becoming quite a simulated experience rather than a real experience. And I remember that last time I referenced the story by Philip K. Dick, where he's inspired by Eisenhower. He posits a, a robotic president who only exists from the waist up, and basically everything that comes out of his mouth is put there by a team of advertising people. Well, this is kind of where they're at. They have all these focus groups, they have all this uh, sophistication or complexity. Um, and again, like, this is not that far from the WWE, because again, I wouldn't say, sophistication is definitely the wrong word. Complexity, however, is there in spades. It is layered so that they can get you to understand. Well, if you understand that so much of it's fake, then they'll always find a way of kind of making you think that some of it's real. Um, so with McMahon, so one of the things that happened was one of the female wrestlers, I think maybe around the time that he was quite credibly accused by a female referee, the first female referee, of having done sexually harassed her in a very serious way. One of the female wrestlers sued the company for $110 million, and then settled out of court, and then immediately, well, maybe not immediately, but very soon was back working for the WWE, doing storylines where she was like a manipulative hussy, let's say. And meanwhile, Mr. McMahon is having affairs. Like, his whole family, like the whole McMahon family, becomes involved in it, including his wife, who is, at one stage, she plays someone who's mute and in a wheelchair, and he is carrying on with her nurse in front of her. And they play with this sort of thing. It's pretty interesting sort of behavior. I think a psychiatrist could have a field day with it. His daughter is involved. Apparently, I think there was going to be one storyline where she was impregnated by her father, but that was cut, maybe at her insistence. But one storyline they did run was that she she was going to get married in the ring to one of the wrestlers. Then another wrestler interrupts the ceremony and pulls up some footage and says, "Look at this! I drugged you the other night, and then took you to Las Vegas, and we got married there. So you're already married, and don't ask me how many times we consummated the marriage." So this, of course, is a pretty weird, twisted storyline. And what happened was that when McMahon's daughter turned up to the next thing she was in, as a wrestler or as a character or whatever, she was booed, and people held up signs saying "slut." Now, the documentary, Mr. McMahon, would have us believe that this happened organically. This was people's reaction to a story about someone being drugged and raped multiple times and forcibly married against their will. But I have a suspicion. Call me call me a skeptic, but I have a suspicion that the placards that they hold up at these matches are actually handed out by people who who are in the employ of the WWE. So that was their approach to that. And in a weird sort of aside, she actually really did get married to the guy who had to pretended that he drugged and raped her. So, and then the storyline, of course, they incorporate that into their storyline. The storyline is the wrestler, and she are running things and trying to push Mr. McMahon out, and then his son does a comeback and fights them over it. It's all very uh, convoluted. And again, like often there are these inflection points where they choose to, like a lot of it's like for most of the people watching, it's clearly entertainment, but there are these inflection points where they choose to try and push things in a direction where you don't know what it is or isn't real. And the documentary, again, so-called documentary, seems to indulge that rather a lot. There is another point that where they seem to deliberately support the fictions of the WWE, because there was a fight that supposedly one person was supposed to win the fight to win the belt or whatever, but McMahon was pissed off at them and kind of flipped it without telling them, and then it was like this big betrayal that they call the Montreal screw job, and it's kind of like it keeps being referenced again as this kind of reality point to anchor people into thinking that there's something real, even though they're pretending. It's pretty weird, but you can see how it works when you do it, and the documentary is in on this, in that it presents the Montreal screw job as being something that actually happened when it clearly didn't. There is backstage footage of people reacting to it, including a guy saying, "I swear to God, I knew nothing about it," and a woman says to him, "You can swear to God, but one day God will strike you down," and it's like that's not a realistic way of speaking. That is the hyperbolic language, the melodramatic language of professional wrestling. So it's clearly a scripted line. Yet they pretend that that's the case in order to maintain this sort of thing that they can hang all this fictional stuff off while making people think, oh, which parts of this are real? What's actually going on? And keeping them involved in that sense. So again, you can sort of see with like so many indications of I don't know, lovey-dovey sort of collegiality in the duopoly of politics in the US, and like you you see like, well, I mean, it's like um, Michelle Obama being mates with George W. Bush and their great relationship and all of this sort of thing, and then we all love John McCain, and Dick Cheney is an honourable whatever, honourable war criminal, whatever the fuck, like you like all of this sort of stuff, and then they bring in like and then you get people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who not only acts as if she's just walked, you know, out into the to the centre ring in a world wrestling entertainment bout, but also kind of creates this sense that there is something else going on, and none of which seems to actually change any of the realities of the politics and the policies. So it seems to be a massive distraction from the real shape of things, which is, um, yeah, um, far less competitive. Let's put it that way. Far less inimical between the two parties. And of course, I mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene, but Trump is the obvious person who does this. It comes out as this larger than life character to distract from the actualities that are really quite in front of your face. So, um, what else? What was I going to say? So, you know, I mean, again, I think maybe I don't need to talk about this much longer. I think that the reality is that it is not reality; it's simulated. I think that it's pretty fair to conclude that the people who really pulled the strings with the Democratic campaign this time round were more than happy for Donald Trump to win. Um, if they um, if they were really worried about Trump winning, then they were way more worried about having a more acceptable candidate or more acceptable policies than more popular policies or a more popular candidate than that. So, I mean, their worries about him winning must have been, in relative terms, fairly minor, despite what they might have said about fascism and the end of democracy in the last election ever, and all of that sort of um, hopefully exaggerated stuff. So yeah, I will stop there. I made a lot of recommendations for reading last time, many of which will cover the material this time. So I'm not going to mention much. However, that Norman Solomon book, War Made Invisible, I'm really liking that. I never read War Made Easy, but this is a more up-to-date version, and it's really disturbing. But it should be. I mean, we live in a very fucked up empire, and anything that says otherwise is no fucking good. Right, and also I'd like to mention as well a book called Chums by Simon Cooper, spelt with a K, Kuper. It's about the I may have previously said Cambridge, but it's actually Oxford. The number of uh, Oxford students who then go on to run politics in the UK. So amongst these include Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, David Cameron, George Osborne, Theresa May, Dominic Cummings, Daniel Hannan, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, they're all very similar sort of age. They went to Oxford, often crossing over in time. They're all conservatives. However, um, another conservative, but who wasn't a conservative when she was at Oxford, was Liz Truss, and another person at Oxford at the same time as them was Keir Starmer. Now, I want to bring that up because it talks about the politics being very much instrumental. They use student politics as a sort of playground for simply working out how to say what you need to say to get ahead. They like conservative politics because it is better for that sort of sociopathic brand. But I think it's fair to say that people could look at the Labour Party and say, "Oh, there's more room for me there. I will go with that party," and then use exactly the same sociopathic politics but using that as a vehicle. So this, I think, such people, again, like I've mentioned before, that we are losing the people who come out of an activist and ideologically committed background, and we have more and more of these megalomaniac assholes who basically believe that the job of politics is to run people's lives for them, even though they often pretend to be of a libertarian bent. They believe in manipulating people. They believe in power. They want power, and so they can, much like um, the the way people say the populares in Rome were, which I don't believe they necessarily were, but they can simply latch on to parties, established leftist or centre-left parties like the Democrats, like UK Labour, like New Zealand Labour, like Australian Labour, like the Canadian Liberals, and I'm sure many similar parties in the non-English speaking world. They can latch onto them as vehicles where they are simply using them in order to advance their own good, but also an elite pro-empire agenda. Um, One of the things that has been said about Tony Blair is that Tony Blair was Thatcher's greatest triumph because she'd managed to make the Labour Party into a Conservative Party. Anyway, so that is me, yeah, rambling on about another book, but it is actually related. I mean, you can see how these things all fit together. It does create a politics where everything is instrumentalized. It's run by the public facing part is all instrumentalized. The politics are stripped out, they're replaced with communications techniques. The actual politics behind it are basically dominated by sociopathic pro pro empire politics, and this is what we're left with, and it does rather look like the insanity of world wrestling entertainment. All right, thank you for listening, and I will catch you next time.